Sun Tzu said that no state profits from prolonged conflict. Short wars start off short, then stretch out, ruining the belligerents. Just look at Ukraine and Russia. What were the blunders that have led to the current slaughter in Europe? Sun Tzu's dictum is a truism, because it's true. Join me, Darasz, for how we got here.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine has exacted a toll unseen in Europe since the Second World War. Russia's imperial ambitions come at the cost of billions of dollars in infrastructure and equipment and an incalculable price in human lives. For the world, this war started on February 24, 2022. But ask any Ukrainian and they'll name a different year. They'll say the war began in 2014. This is the Maidan revolution of that same year. The protests came on the heels of then-President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to not tighten ties with the EU and instead pursue a closer relationship with Russia. These tumultuous protests ended in Yanukovych's ousting, but Russia was not keen on letting its influence in Ukraine slip away. Some credit this man, Igor Girkin, as the one who started the Russo-Ukrainian War. He seized Sloviansk in early 2014. Russia's annexation of Crimea soon followed. What was the West's response back then? Did the might of NATO come down upon Russia for this violation of international law? No. It came in the same form we saw in 2022, albeit much weaker.
Together, we will ensure that this isolation deepens. Sanctions will expand, and the toll on Russia's economy, as well as its standing in the world, will only increase.
Economic sanctions have been the brunt of the West's response to Russia's actions since then. After 2014, many countries have offered Ukraine aid, both military and non-military, both material and non-material. Though most of this aid came either during the lead-up to the 2022 invasion, or once it had already happened. Some say that it had been too little, too late. The West has been openly displaying its support for Ukraine's cause. World leaders have been flocking to Ukraine and promises of new weapons and cash have been flowing. All the while Vladimir Putin has been shunned by Western leaders and has been forced to turn to new allies. Ukraine has been given weapons such as these to defend itself, the HIMARS, the Storm Shadows and many others. To defend itself, while Ukrainian leadership believes that to defeat Moscow, the best defense is offense, and has been asking to strike deep into Russian territory.
We do this thanks to our capabilities, our weapons, with those means that partners can provide and which can significantly accelerate the end of this war.
The United States, Ukraine's most important ally, has refused to permit Kiev to use long-range arms to strike deep into Russian territory. But the same went for the F-16 fighter jets, which the West was very hesitant to deliver to Ukraine, despite criticism. As was the case with even different equipment, like the M1 Abrams tanks. Each time the West eventually gave Ukraine what it had asked for, though it was months after the initial requests. And each time the West delays, the price Kiev pays goes up. A price not in money, but in blood.
I'm delighted to be joined today by Benjamin Schmitt, a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. Welcome along.
Thanks, great to be here in Warsaw.
Hope your stay is a good one so far.
Absolutely, it's always great to be in Poland.
Fantastic. Ukraine and Western policy, that's going to be our main theme. Is Western policy towards the Russo-Ukrainian war coherent or confused?
It's confused. It is, in general, trying to be supportive. I think that we've done a lot of good things over the years since Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, but we haven't ever done enough. That's both on the military support side and on the sanctions side, and we can talk more about that. But I just testified before U.S. Congress last week, and what I told the lawmakers in Washington is that I need to see more of the direct support towards Ukrainian victory, and that's what the Ukrainians expect, and that's what the transatlantic community expects. And we've always been in, I'm a physicist by training, in an X-1 approach in terms of an equation, where X is whatever the current policy, military system, or sanction that we should have been doing to support Ukraine and push back on Russia's aggression. And we're always in an X-1 mode where we're one step behind, and frankly, not just one step behind temporally in terms of the time, but also usually under budget and not actually supporting in the magnitude that we need.
How do you account for that? There's this lag, this Western lag in between action and rhetoric, I suppose?
Well, look, there's been discussions at the Warsaw Security Forum where I'm here in Warsaw this week speaking at. And one of the big things that I think has gone on is that there are some members of the transatlantic community that I think want to maintain the pre-2022 status quo, which of course from 2014 to 2022 wasn't very good for the Ukrainians, right? They were invaded in the Donbass in 2014 and Crimea was illegally annexed. So the war has been going on for a decade now. And, you know, it's you'll hear from Ukrainians, Ukrainian children that were 10 years old when Crimea was annexed are now dying on the front lines. This war has been going on for over a decade now. And so we have to remember the fact that this has been long term, and we have taken a number of steps that have been really incommensurate with Ukrainian victory. Before the large-scale invasion, of course, things like supporting Nord Stream 2 that the Germans did, and all of these sort of economic policies with the Kremlin that was basically designed to not push back, to try to have the status quo. And I think you still have members of the transatlantic community, and I think in corners of Berlin and other countries and certain parts of Washington that want this kind of de-escalation and the quote-unquote escalation management, which of course is a modern equivalent of the previous appeasement strategies.
Yes, there's a strain of opinion just wants it to go away. And
exactly.
Has there been an effective, in your judgment, effective definition of victory? You mentioned the idea of victory. Has that been defined? I mean, you go into a war and you have your war aims.
Right.
We are de facto at war in terms of indirectly, just by supplying and supporting Ukraine. Have we defined what we want?
No, not at all. We've continued to use rhetoric like we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, as long as we can, and these sort of constructions. That is insufficient, right? It's not just the fact that Ukraine is sustaining this, humanitarian onslaught, this evil invasion from Russia. The West is being targeted as well. We have seen dozens and dozens of sabotage incidents against energy and critical infrastructure across the European continent, across NATO member states. And we're not yet willing to even use Article 4 in the NATO alliance to basically look at and have a consultative mechanism at NATO headquarters where we're calling out, naming and shaming and saying that our policy is to actually push back on Russian aggression. Poland, the Czech Republic, the United Kingdom, and France have attributed these attacks to Russian actors or non-Russian nationals, Ukrainians and Belarusians and Poles and others that have been hired by the GRU for cheap, basically, on social media, on Telegram, and have conducted these attacks. And we know that these are happening. These are attributed. So we need NATO to step up with Article 4 and actually say what sort of situation we're in and what the alliance is going to do. Again, this is sub-threshold level acts of aggression, not all-out war, but if it's a shadow war, it's a hybrid war, it's a war at the end of the day.
I mean, you need people to conduct your war. Do we have the right caliber of political class to manage this situation?
I think parts of the transatlantic community are well suited to this. NATO's eastern flank countries, the Baltic states, Poland, etc. I think also the Nordic states. You look at Mette Frederiksen in Denmark. You look at Kaja Kallas in Estonia, who's of course now moved on to be High Representative and Foreign Policy Chief at the EU. But they understand the threat. They understand the threshold and what we need to do to push back. And we have leaders in particular in parts of Washington and parts of Berlin that, again, want to basically escalation manage. And we're going to have all of these sort of debates over weapon systems, over sanctions in public. We're having these debates in public. Folks like me in the expert community have to basically continuously engage. We didn't do this during World War II. Any sort of conflict where you've actually had these sort of decisions being made in public, we didn't debate how we were going to defeat the Nazis. We simply did it. And the military leaders knew knew what they had to do to win. We need that sort of strategy for Ukraine, and we need that sort of strategy for the entire transatlantic community to basically say, we are pushing back on Putin's Kremlin. We are not going to return to business as usual, as much as maybe some in the German energy and business community want to, and have the resurrection of Nord Stream 2, which would be a disaster in terms of malign influence and signaling to the Kremlin. But I know that there are actors in Germany that are pushing for that right now. We can't let the ghosts back out of the trap. We've basically curtailed Russian malign energy influence, and that has to end, and it has to end here.
That's a recipe for a very long war, isn't it?
It can be, but it also can be that we actually say, okay, this drip of military, this slow, level of sanctions and sanctions enforcement. I think that is prolonging the war, and you're going to end up with a situation where even with the best intentions, Ukraine could possibly bleed out. We can't allow that to happen. We can't allow a democracy to be extinguished because we decided to take this victory approach where we're going to hold Ukraine's head above water to make sure it doesn't drown, but basically it ends up drowning in the end.
What are the concrete things that Ukraine needs on the battlefield and then in the sanctions arena?
Sure. So we're back at the same sort of thing. Remember at the start of the war when the big threshold was stingers and javelins? Are we kidding ourselves? We had these debates over Leopard tanks. We had these debates over HIMARS and all these sort of systems.
Yes.
Absolutely. And so now we have F-16s that are being given to the Ukrainians, and that's the latest threshold that we've actually cleared. But again, now we're in the next debate. Can we allow UK Storm Shadow missiles and US ATACMS missiles to be used to take out the actual launch facilities on the territory of the Russian Federation? And I think that has to happen. We saw Zelensky go to the White House and talk to President Biden and try to get that sort of agreement last week. It didn't happen.
How did he argue his case, President Biden, for not allowing the Storm Shadow, the longer range missiles, munitions to hit Russia? If you're fighting a war, you throw everything, the kitchen sink at each other. That's the way you do it. Yeah. What's the actual rationale for tying one hand behind Ukraine's back?
That is a great question, and something that I wish the Biden administration, even if it's a policy that would be unpopular, would come out and say very clearly. Because what we hear is a lot of rhetoric. When we hear this, we say we're going to support Ukraine, we're doing everything we can. They say all of the right things, but they're not taking the right actions to actually support those aims. And so we need an actual victory plan like Zelensky has laid out, and actually support that to come true, right? We can do that. We are global democracies. There's nothing we can't do if we put our minds to it. And on the sanctions front, I mean, energy sanctions, technology export controls, we've had a lot of macroeconomic impacts that are detrimental to the Russian Federation and its war effort. The same thing with interrupting supply chains. The reason that those aren't, quote unquote, working, they work. We don't have enough sanctions officials to actually pull this off at the scale that we're talking about. The Russian sanctions that we're talking about are the largest in the history of humanity, okay? People don't remember this, right? And so even if the scale of the sanction, we have tough sanctions on them now, it should be tougher and much deeper. But even if we just enforced all of the sanctions now, that would be a big step forward. And we can't, because we only have so many officials. There's only a few hundred in the United States. There's probably an equivalent amount in the EU. And we're talking about one of the largest sanctions regimes ever attempted in the history of humanity.
Russia seems to have time on its side. Meanwhile, we see fissures emerge in the European cohesiveness. Russia is winning so far, isn't she?
Well, I wouldn't say that she's winning. I mean,
despite all the bloodshed that
absolutely.
It's willing to take.
Look, the Ukrainians have invaded Kursk. They've invaded the Russian Federation's territory proper. And I think what that shows us is that there's no red line that the Kremlin has put forward that the Ukrainians haven't been able to shatter and explain to the transatlantic community that the Putin regime is beatable in this case. And so this can happen. And I think part of the reason that they took this operation is not only signaling, it's also because they have not been allowed to, again, use these long-range weapons to take out the launch facilities. So they actually have to go on the ground and try to take them out in Kursk. And that's kind of what they're demonstrating. And this isn't just about the the war effort itself. It's about making sure that there's not a humanitarian nightmare that's continuing this winter. Remember, 80% of thermal power capacity in Ukraine has been destroyed by Russia, 50% of electricity grid capacity. And what we're looking at is, where are those launches coming from? They're coming from these launch sites. And so if the West, even for those that don't want a moral victory, and I think you and I probably do, I certainly do, look, we can make the pragmatic economic argument to those that aren't moved by the cause of democracy and the cause of freedom, and say it is going to cost us as the transatlantic community a hell of a lot more to completely rebuild the energy system and the energy infrastructure across all of Ukraine, that is to allow for more air defense, but also for the Ukrainians to actually take out the archers instead of the arrows by actually hitting the strike facilities. And we're in the third winter that the Ukrainians are going to have to suffer through this energy infrastructure, energy poverty nightmare, and it's only getting worse.
Aren't we facing an unpalatable question about we're fighting Russia, but we don't want Russia to collapse? I mean, those two are incompatible logically.
I think so, but we're nowhere near Russian collapse. I mean, I think that the idea of this is to simply get Russia out of Ukraine. Period, right? We can't allow a sovereign democracy to be invaded by an authoritarian nation and basically have the Russians get away with this. That will be a signal to Iran. We see what it's doing towards Israel right now, which is horrific. It would be a signal towards the People's Republic of China to possibly take action against Taiwan and all of the other authoritarian Axis nations around the world to get together and say, look, the democracies aren't going to protect their own freedoms. We'll just, basically go after them.
A final question to you. What do you say to the, if we can call them the pacifistic voices about, Ukraine will have to negotiate territory, land for peace, I suppose is the phrase there. And yet we say we're going to support Ukraine right to the hilt. Ultimately, they're going to have to do some negotiation on border issues.
So I think that the Zelensky office, the president's office, has made it clear that this is going to ultimately end in a negotiation of some kind. But I would remind folks in the West that are eager to get this over with, and certainly those that want to return to energy and business as usual. Yeah. There won't be a return to business as usual. If there was a ceasefire tomorrow, it is absolutely too dangerous to ever return to business as usual with the Putin regime. He has weaponized all of these areas of economic trade with us for years, not just against Ukraine, but against the entirety of the Western community. But look, I would say as a message to those people, are you really comfortable consigning millions of Ukrainians to live under the Putin regime and the sort of war crimes and the sort of humanitarian nightmare and all of the sort of acts of violence and torture and rape and murder that we have seen? And it tugs at the heartstrings when you hear directly from the Ukrainians that have experienced this. We saw this at the Warsaw Security Forum this week. Are you really, as a transatlantic leader, allowing yourself to sit there and sleep well at night and consign those people to live under that sort of terror? And I think the answer has to be no if you have a moral, fiber in your body and want to actually defend democracy. So we really can't have another 40 years of occupation like the Baltic states have and say that's good enough. The Wells Declaration was great. We didn't ever recognize the Baltic states. But guess what? We can't. You can say the same thing politically, but you can't consign those people right now to that sort of fate for another 4 decades.
Yes, let's hope so. Unfortunately, many people probably can live with Eastern Europe just drifting away.
We can't stand for that.
Yeah. Benjamin Schmitt, thank you very much for coming along to the programme.
Thanks so much. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
That's all we have time for today. Keep watching TVP World. In the meantime, join us again next time on How We Got Here.